This afternoon, I want to think about, I guess, part of what I was presenting last week, my gosh, on Monday, last year. On Monday, I talked about the architecture of extermination in the camps and what visual culture can maybe do to push us pedagogically in terms of thinking about the production of the Zigeunerlager. Today, I want to kind of take the flip side of this. And it's from a project that I've been working on that in my head, since we're all amongst friends and family, I can tell you that I call the project Badass Gypsies, but only in my head. And the reason I do that is because, again, it's part of the other side of looking at the experiences of the Holocaust, right? Because when we, as activists, for example, as Romani activists, as Roma and Sinti activists, one of the things that people have struggled with for decades now, and not just activists, but also the academics, right? We've been doing research to stake our claim on the camp and to document our place within the logic of extermination that was Nazi genocide. But there's another side of that, and I think that's really, we have to do that. I mean, and that's what Hristo's paper, his wonderful paper on Monday, was about, with looking at the legacy of this and what happens then in current scientific knowledge and current everyday experiences of Roma and Sinti children. And for this, I guess this other project that I want to look at are the kinds of practices of resistance. And we all know that Roma and Sinti people were very active in the resistance to the Nazis. But I feel like because it's taken so much for us to stake the claims of victimhood, right? Because that wasn't recognized. It hasn't been recognized. It continues to be denied. That we focus maybe less on the ways in which Roma, despite incredible odds, were able to resist Nazism. And in terms of our pedagogy and in terms of our academic research, in terms of our activism, but also in terms of what it is that the legacy that we give to our children, what I'm interested in also are the possibilities of politics that go beyond the paradigm of resistance. So Wendy Brown, who's a feminist philosopher in the US, she has a term that she talks about, about states of, her book is called States of Injury. But she talks about feminist and queer and people of color kinds of politics as based upon this idea of ressentiment, right? Of the idea of a remembered injury. And in a lot of ways that becomes a productive politics. But I also want to think about what the other possibilities perhaps of politics are. And so part of it is if I focus a little bit, and this isn't going to be a kind of deep scholarly article, it's really just the beginnings of a project that's going to come in a few years. But what I'd like to do is to focus on the kinds of daring and heroism and the activism of Romani people, both within the Second World War against the Nazis, but also afterwards. So part of this was based upon this, if anyone, you probably didn't, part of this was based upon a speech that I gave at the United Nations in January for Holocaust Memorial Day. But since then, I've turned it into the beginnings of a longer scholarly article. So if some of you find this familiar, you'll know why in parts. But in other parts, you'll see that I'm trying to work through some of the other stuff that I've been researching on Roma people and Sinti people and resistance. So I'm beginning with the image of the memorial, which in October 2012 in Berlin, the memorial for the murdered Roma and Sinti under National Socialism was dedicated. Directly across from the Reichstag in the Tiergarten. And that memorial came 30 years, which I said this to you last week. The memorial came 30 years after Germany officially recognized the racially based motives for annihilation of the Roma and Sinti. Its inauguration occurred nearly 40 years after the first activists began calling attention to the losses suffered by Roma and Sinti communities, after their persecution had gone unacknowledged in the decades after the end of World War II. At the inauguration of the Roma and Sinti Memorial, Romani Rosa, the head of the German Council of Sinti and Roma, and a Sinto activist who lost 13 members of his family at Auschwitz-Birkenau, said, quote, "There is not a single family of Sinti and Roma in Germany who have not lost immediate family members. It shapes our identity to this day," end quote. So the Holocaust claimed the lives of 3/4 of the Roma and Sinti population in Europe. In some areas, such as the Czech Republic and parts of Poland, the Romani population was decimated. The persecution of Roma and Sinti, as we know, predated the Nazi era, with historiographic evidence of pogroms, harassment, and genocide reaching as far back into the Middle Ages and through the 19th century. While under Article 109 of the Weimar Constitution, Roma and Sinti were accorded full and equal citizenship rights. By 1926, Bavaria required registration of all Sinti and Roma and instituted measures for combating gypsies and vagabonds and the work shy. And in 1936, the Central Office for Combating the Gypsy Nuisance opened in Munich. The Interior Ministry set up directives authorizing people to conduct raids on gypsies in preparation for the Berlin Olympics. That same year, Roma and Sinti became subject to the Nuremberg race laws, and many Roma and Sinti who came under the scrutiny of the state were forcibly sterilized. And here I'm showing you an image of the first concentration camp that was opened up for Sinti and Roma, called the Zigeunerlager, was established at Marzahn on the outskirts of Berlin on July 16, 1936. Located between a sewage dump and a cemetery, the camp imprisoned Roma and Sinti who had been rounded up during the pre-Olympic period. So in preparation for the 1936 Olympics, as again, this is not, I think, news to anybody, right? But just as with all sort of Olympics, right? If we think about the 2012 Olympics in London, it's not just that 500 people in council houses in London, right, were cleared out of that area to make a space for the Olympic site. But as we know, two of the most significant Gypsy Roma traveler sites were also cleared away to make way for the London Olympics. And I could sort of continue this and say in Belgrade in 2007, in preparation for the Universiade, the University Olympics, first in 2007, the Roma settlement was cleared to make space for the sporting complex and the houses of the athletes. And then when the Roma came back in 2012, 2013 to resettle in that site in Belleville, across from the Delta Mall in Belgrade, they were cleared away yet again. So I guess part of, before I move maybe into the resistance question, to say, it's really interesting. One of the things I've been compiling in my research are all the evidences where, in order to make way for a big international event, Roma and Sinti have to be cleared away. It happened, with the 1961, I think, meeting of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade. Also, the road that went from the airport to the House of Parliament and to the President's house was also cleared of all of the Roma along the way, so that the international leaders from all over the Third World particularly wouldn't have to see Belgrade's Romani residents. But the instance of that, the first one in the 20th century in terms of a big sporting event, was 1936 Olympics in Berlin. So some of the photos that I'm going to show you, there's Marzahn. That's the very beginning. That was the first kind of formation of the concentration camp in Nazi Germany. But then some of these other photos that I wanted to just show you document Roma and Sinti experiences of the Holocaust. Right, you've got roundups, you've got the identity cards. My Hungarian colleagues will recognize the language here. And you see it's the gypsy identity card. Images of before the Holocaust. This is in France, in Rivesaltes. A transit camp that actually existed. It didn't close in 1945, but actually existed through 1947 in the area near the French Pyrenees. So these photos portray individuals, families, communities about whose fate we know nothing and whose stories aren't told in history books, nor most likely are they ones that would be commemorated in national archives. So while concentration camps are the best documented sites of wartime atrocity by the Nazis and their allies, their prisoners tortured, worked to death, gassed, and murdered by other means, as we know, they are just one facet of the genocidal project of the Holocaust in Europe. Faut répéter? Non? Oui? Autrefois? Plus lente. While the concentration camps are the best documented sites of wartime atrocity by the Nazis and their allies, and as we know, prisoners were tortured, worked to death, gassed, and murdered by other means. They are just one set or one facet of the genocidal project of the Holocaust in Europe. Approximately 20,000 concentration camps were set up across Europe, some for transport, others for forced labor, and still others for mass murder. Along with the concentration camps that imprisoned millions, ghettos were set up in major cities, set apart by brick walls, barbed wire, and armed guards, housing Jews, Roma and Sinti, and others. In Poland, in the Czech Republic, and beyond, German troops, Wehrmacht, and police murdered countless Roma and Sinti who were buried in mass graves in the countryside. As you know, I don't know how many people know this, but every July in Tarno, there's a a mobile commemoration of the sites in the woods that were sites of massacre by Roma and Sinti around the area. And every July, people put up makeshift memorials of wood or of stone to commemorate the dead. And usually by the next July, they've been taken down. They're gone. So it's important to kind of think about what it means, the constant practice of memorialization. Along with official and unofficial pogroms throughout Europe, the mobile death squads, the Einsatzgruppen, were deployed across the countryside as Nazis pushed eastward toward the Soviet Union. The numbers of Roma and Sinti who perished in the camps is only part of the story. And the excavation of mass graves, most unmarked, and the identification of those buried in them is still being carried out in the eastern part of Europe in the present day. So in this way, there's much work still to be done to document Romani experiences of the Holocaust, and still much more to determine an accurate estimate of the numbers who were murdered, both inside the camps and by mobile killing squads of the Nazis and their allies, by local pogroms and other forms of violence. And in the 70 years since the end of World War II, we still have no accurate account of the Roma and Sinti lives lost during the Holocaust, especially the areas in the East, where the Romani population was greater, and we can assume the number of those murdered might have risen accordingly. So in that way, I believe, just like with Sarno or with other memorials, it's important, it's crucial for us to hold these memorial ceremonies and to remember the dead, and to set aside spaces and monuments to those who were murdered, to those who lost family, loved ones, and community, and to those who returned from the camps. Weird fuzz in my mouth. Sorry. Or hiding, only to find their cultures and their life worlds decimated, to those who survived genocide. But at the same time, as we're remembering the dead and commemorating the survivors, I want us to think about other people, those who reached out beyond their families, beyond their communities, and who, in the work of saving the lives of others, ran the risk of losing their own. So, if we're in our classrooms, be it in university classrooms, probably not in pre-secondary classrooms, but I don't know what the policy here in France or in other places is about teaching the Holocaust. But what would it mean for us to perhaps focus a bit on the Roma and Sinti resistance to the terror and destruction carried out by the Nazis and their allies? I guess for me, this becomes a really important question when we think about a Romani politics. And in some ways, I know that there are lots of places in Europe where you have, well, throughout Europe, we have Roma who have resisted, have really pushed back, and not just to protect their communities, but to create a new politics. But I'm wondering if we could focus a bit on the kinds of resistance to the Nazi terror that occurred, to think about the possibility of politics in the current moment. So one of the most significant, and I mentioned it briefly on Monday, but understudied acts of resistance that were carried out by Roma and Sinti was in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And it occurred on the 15th to 16th of May, 1944, in the Zigeunerlager at Auschwitz-Birkenau, at Birkenau II. Roma and Sinti prisoners were deported to Auschwitz in family groups. Again, it's well known. And at least 23,000 were murdered in the gas chambers there. Throughout the network of death camps and mobile gassing units, Jews and Gypsies were the two groups systematically targeted for murder. By the end of 1943, Nazis had imprisoned nearly 19,000 Roma and Sinti in the Birkenau Gypsy camp. By May 1944, only 6,000 remained, with the others having been gassed or deported to other camps for forced labor. On the 15th of May, 1944, the prisoners in the Zigeunerlager discovered that the Nazis planned to gas all 6,000 of those who remained. When the SS guards armed with machine guns surrounded the camp for transport to the gas chambers that were very, within vision, they, quote, met with armed resistance. After stealing scraps of sheet metal, the prisoners had sharpened the metal into crudely fashioned knives. With these, they improvised weapons, and with iron pipes, clubs, and stones, the gypsies defended themselves. In the midst of it, the guards began to shoot at the resistors, end quote. We never, and this is, I think, how many of you know this? Who knows about this story? Okay, so I feel like in some ways it's really key to do more research on this. What made it possible? Thinking about Ciprian's presentation about the Romano Butti, right, and what it is that people do, how people do things. To think about almost a year in the camps, and the kind of will that it took to create that kind of armed resistance in ways that it didn't happen in the other camps, it didn't happen in the other parts of Auschwitz. And the ingenuity that it took to make the weapons out of nothing. For me, that's something that's really, it sticks there. It's really key. The ways in which, people were able to make things out of nothing and to push back with these homemade weapons in the face of machine guns without any food. I mean, the whole way in which we think about this. So these unnamed heroes, right? We don't know the names of the people who carried out this resistance. We don't know who made the guns, who made the knives, who fought back against the machine guns. But over the course of those 2 days in May, they held off the Nazi guards and were able to stop, for a few months at least, the liquidation of the Zigeunerlager. Of course, the final liquidation took place on the 2nd of August, 1944, when the guards gassed nearly 3,000 men, women, and children in the middle of the night. Even at the last moment, there was resistance. According to documents located at the Memorial Museum of Auschwitz-Birkenau, quote, the prisoners attempted to resist, but the SS crushed their opposition brutally, end quote. So these moments, right, these near impossible, I would argue pretty much completely impossible, except that they happened, uprisings by Roma and Sinti men, women, and children at the death camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau are part of the larger story of uprisings and other forms of resistance in which Roma and Sinti played a part. We have no documentation, for example, on Romani participation in ghetto uprisings, unless someone knows of some that I don't. No, okay. That was a call. Okay, no. It's work to do. Now I've lost my place. Right, so we have no documentation. Huh? But were there Roman Sinti in the Warsaw Ghetto in the resistance? Do we know? In the uprising?
You are talking. Your question is about resistance in lager.
In the ghettos as well. I'm asking you if anyone knows of evidence of resistance in the ghettos. Tell me. Yeah? Des
That
témoignages.
I have in my head that just now, no. But,
Thank you, sorry.
but I know there is some. I heard people talking sometimes.
Yeah?
But I'm not sure. No, I just say that I heard some people talking act of resistance in ghetto and lager by their family, as well Rome people, that Jewish people.
Yeah.
But of course, there is a big thing like the Varsovia ghetto. That there is some documents, by example, but I have some little. I heard something.
Recorded?
Not a film, but recorded. Yeah.
Yeah.
Recorded by the aunt of Manouch's friend.
Oh.
In France. I heard Rachel father. She heard someone who come back from the leg and talk about resistance in leg. Just they were in the Thunder Commando, you know, and so something. So there is also a Sorbibor, but there it's a Jew person. But I have not my head very clear just now. I heard to you, but I cannot say that I don't see who heard something directly or by someone talking, right? Or someone talking from a family. That's all.
Thank you. I mean, maybe we can talk about that. And I guess I'm going to go off script a little bit and just say, I think that's the only way we get any evidence of any of it. And it's only through hearing people talk that we're going to have any of this history or any of these archives. I mean, again, well, not only. Okay, not only. But that's a key part. Do you want me to finish? I'll finish. No, well, that way you don't have to run around. I'll finish. Say it then, come. Sorry.
So yes, there is some material. There is a very good documentary movie made by an archivist, French archivist, whose name is Raphaël Pilosio. Raphaël Pilosio.
Mm-hmm.
Et le titre du documentaire, qui date de 2009, c'est un très très bon documentaire, ça s'appelle Des Français sans histoire.
Uh-huh.
Et ça parle donc des camps d'internement en France, et c'est de la mémoire orale en fait.
De la résistance.
Et de la résistance manouche, yéniche, rome. Et certains des protagonistes ont même du matériel, enfin des papiers, des archives, des cartes de résistants. Enfin, il y a du matériel physique à interpréter aussi, et documenté à interpréter. Il y a de la parole et du matériel.
Okay, so thank you. Well, I guess so that, some of that I would love to know more about that, and I guess part of I was specifically asking about was in the ghettos, but also I think it's really important to document the stuff on the resistance in France, and I think for us pedagogically and as academics to focus on some of that stuff, and I guess we have. So, like I said, this is very. For me, this is stuff that I wasn't thinking of doing except, yeah, okay. Is it there? Hi.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
If you're looking for places to do research or to find potential evidence, In Slovakia, there were Roma people who participated in the resistance who were partisans. So I don't know who or where you start, but there are places where you can look for this information. Just wanted to say that.
I do have some evidence, and I'll talk about that now, in the Czech Republic as well. Okay, so I guess in some ways, for me, I didn't want to ever, as an American Romani woman and a scholar, I sometimes find it strange and new to research and write about Holocaust testimonies of Romani survivors. I grew up in a Romani community that didn't talk about the losses suffered in Europe in the Holocaust for various reasons. And while my family members fought against the Nazis during World War II as members of the U.S. Army, we never again talked about that. So in many ways, although we had this kind of history of resistance, again, I feel like it's not necessarily talked about. So as community members, as scholars, as policymakers, as teachers, it's important for us to record and to analyze and to publish the numbers, the stories, the data, the historical facts pertaining to the persecution and genocide of Roma and Sinti. But I think it also thinks about then what kind of lessons can we learn about the pushback, about the resistance against fascism and against genocide that was happening even as people were being murdered. So some of this comes up in the autobiography of Belgian photographer, non-Roma photographer Jan Joers, where Roma and Sinti across Europe took part in resistance activities. And he records the day-to-day life of the Lovaro family with which he lived in France. And he says, quote, Roma used their wagons to transport refugees and smuggle small arms and explosives. The frequent movement of those gypsies also allowed them to accrue ration cards under different names and in a variety of places. These ration cards were important in supplying food to resistance fighters. And when German authorities began tighter scrutiny of rations, the Joers group joined French partisans in raiding ration distribution posts. They also brought the partisans' news heard on BBC radio broadcasts, end quote. And I spoke about, at the Holocaust Memorial Ceremony, the person I spoke in most in depth about was Alfreda Markowska, a Polish Romani woman who was born in 1926 under a caravan in Stanislaw, Poland. As the president of Poland recounted in 2006, in 1941 her family was murdered and taken captive. After her escape from prison, she and her husband resided first in the Lublin ghetto and later in Łódź and Belgique. She escaped from each of these places, saving Jewish and Romani children. Upon receiving the news of yet another pogrom, she would visit execution sites in search of surviving children. She then transported the survivors to her base and procured false papers for them. Some of them she gave back to their guardians, and others she placed in the care of Romani families or brought them up herself. So Mrs. Markowska saved nearly 50 Jewish and Romani children over the course of the war. And in 2006, she was awarded the Commander's Cross with a Star of the Order of Polonia Restituta for heroism by the Polish president. And for me, this actually, her example remains a model, right? It's a model of politics in the face of barbarity. So in this way, when we start to look for them in the footnotes of history, in the hundreds of oral and video testimonies of Roma and Sinti survivors, there are moments of compassion, of resistance, of heroism that we can talk about. And so I've been looking at testimonies from the Shoah Visual Archive. There's Amilcare Debar, who worked with the Italian resistance in reconnaissance, scouting and delivering messages, and procuring weapons, and carrying out ambushes and other military operations as a member of the communist partisan group, the Garibaldi Brigade. And Josef Teifel, a Rom from Czechoslovakia, worked clandestinely in the Mukachevo, is that how you say it, ghetto? Mukachevo. Oh, Mukachevo ghetto. So there, and that. Oh, okay. So the Mukachevo ghetto, now in Ukraine, and he worked carrying out resistance activities, which I guess is another example of the ghetto resistance. So when I think about the lives, or when we start to think about the lives who have been marked by the enormity of the Holocaust, I think part of what I want to push us to think about again is the possibilities of politics. Hundreds of thousands of Roma and Sinti were murdered. And yet, we're still struggling to get the documentation of even the fact that they were in the camps. And in this way, I welcome the opportunity to recall the names of the Roma and Sinti survivors and the resistance people. But I also want to think about other ways that we can, and again, I'm sort of thinking that this is what I'm giving you is a sketch and an outline, and I'm wondering what we can do politically and what we can do as scholars to push this agenda forward. Some other examples that I've been looking at is it was a feminist artist who was in the US in the 1960s called Florica. And her name was Florica Remetier. And her parents were born in what is now Ukraine. And publicly, she was a radical artist. She committed suicide in the mid-1970s. But the first record of her is in a concentration camp, or a displaced persons camp in 1952, where she was a child prodigy playing violin. And in the 1960s, coming out of that experience where they were refugees, they ended up in the US. In the 1960s, her artwork was focused on anti-capitalism and feminism. And she organized and participated in a hex on Wall Street in 1968. And after the hex on Wall Street, the stock market went down, but that's a whole other question for at least a day. But how do we excavate the stories, or how is it important for us to excavate these stories as a form of what Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe would sort of point out as counter-hegemonic moments? And I guess the question I have for you is, are they important? Does it, in the end, does it matter? And how is it that we then, in the face of these counter-hegemonic moments, in the face of these pushes, do we go on with the everyday business of, being academics, of being activists, and of trying to stake our claim? So again, this presentation, I'm sorry, I'm finished. I cut out a lot of it, but I wanted to put these questions on, and I feel like we've had a very intense week, and to have us kind of open up and talk more about the possibilities of politics and the possibilities of what it might mean to be badass Roma in the current moment. I'm done. So any questions, any comments? Whatever, yeah, thanks. I know it was crazy. Thanks.